It's the first person who stands gets to go first. We do just ask that you state your name, your suburb and the item on which you're speaking, and also just to state that if you have provided submissions previously or submissions in writing, just to acknowledge that the agenda is response to previous public questions taken on notice. There are nil. And the next item 4, applications for leave of absence, we do have 2. The first is Councillor Dan Loden requesting a leave of absence from 4th of December 2018 to the 18th of December 2018 due to personal commitments. Can I please have a mover and a seconder? Moved Councillor Harley, seconded Councillor Gondaszewski. All those in favour? I declare that carried. Secondly, 4.2, Councillor Jimmy Murphy requesting a leave of absence from 3rd of December to the 17th of December due to personal commitments. Can I please have a mover for this item? Moved Councillor Castle, seconded Councillor Harley. All those in favour? I declare it carried. We will now move to the receiving of petitions, deputations and presentations. We did have a request, but I understand that that has now been satisfied. The applicant in relation to 9.1 no longer seeking a deputation. Thank you. So confirmation of minutes, item 6 for the ordinary council meeting of the 16th of October 2018. Can I please have a mover? Moved Councillor Loden and seconded Councillor Gondaszewski. All those in favour? I declare the minutes carried. The next item on the agenda are announcements by the presiding member. I have a few to mention. First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge that on Sunday we had the Centenary of Armistice event at Axford Park at 11 o'clock, which was well attended by the community. It was an event that was in partnership with the Mount Hawthorn sub-branch of the RSL, where we commemorated this significant event, 100 years since the guns fell silent along the Western Front in World War I, and we did have a lovely service with our community. It was great to see people come out and share that together. Also just like to mention that we have launched the City of Vincent Summer Events website. Because we have so many events in Vincent over summer, it does need its own website. It's quite chock-a-block full of events. We've got 50 events at venues across Leederville, North Perth, Mount Norley, West Perth, Northbridge and Mount Hawthorn. So that is available at events.vincent.wa.gov.au. Also just to mention that tonight we do have a very strong focus on our agenda on public open space. We have 2 items this evening under community engagement. First of all, a draft Banks Reserve Master Plan for consideration and a draft public open space strategy for consideration to consent to community consultation. It is a very important priority for the City of Vincent in terms of meeting our community needs now and into the future, and it's good to see these 2 very important bodies of work on the agenda this evening. So if you're interested in what we're doing to grow and improve our public space in Vincent, I would recommend that you do take a look at those 2 items. Thank you. We'll now go to the CEO for item 8, declarations of interest.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. I've received 1 declaration of interest from Councillor Jimmy Murphy, who declares an impartiality interest in item 9.1, Bramwell Street, East Perth, change of use to unlisted use, community purpose. Councillor Murphy discloses that he has an association with the applicant's representative, Roberts Day, the association being that Roberts Day were sponsors of the Town Team Movement Conference, a not-for-profit organisation of which Councillor Murphy is the chairperson. As a consequence, there may be a perception that his impartiality on the matter may be affected, and declares that he will consider this matter on its merits and vote accordingly.
Thank you, CEO. I'll now go around the table and ask council members if they have any other items other than 9.1, which has been raised by the public gallery, and item 13.3, which is an absolute majority decision required to pull out for consideration and debate. Councillor Hallett, any further items? Councillor Castle? Councillor Harley?
No, thank you, Mayor.
Councillor Murphy?
14.1.
Thank you. Councillor Loden?
11.1 and 13.2.
Thank you. Councillor Fotakis? Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. 11.2 and 12.4. Thank you. And 14.1.
Thank you. Councillor Gontaszewski.
I think we need to do 13.3 as well.
Yes, that's an absolute majority decision. Yep. Okay, thank you very much. We'll just go through and list all of those and move on block.
I'll read out the items to be moved en bloc, which includes item 9.2, item 9.3, item 10.1, item 11.3, item 11.4, item 11.5, item 12.1, item 12.2, item 12.3, item 13.1.
Thank you, CEO. Can I please have a mover and seconder for the en bloc items? Move Councillor Harley, seconded Councillor Murphy. All those in favour? I declare the en bloc items carried. So the first item mentioned in the public gallery, the first and only item this evening, was item 9.1, number 13 Bramwell Street, East Perth, change of use to unlisted use community purpose. Can I please have a mover and seconder for this item? Moved Councillor Loden, seconded Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I note there was a number of concerns raised from the gallery, both today and also last week. The four things I particularly picked up was concern about whether this was an appropriate use in a commercial area, safety around accessing the facility across East Parade, concerns around antisocial behaviour. There was a comment around housing prices as well. So I guess in considering those, consider of commercial impact or change to the cost of your house is not a valid planning consideration for the purposes of council's consideration. I do recognise the antisocial behaviour is a concern, and that's valid for people to have that concern, but there are a number of mitigations that are in place because of that. The hours of operation for visitors to the facility are from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. in the middle of the day. There is a management plan that has been required to be put in place. It is there for 12 months and it is under review. And similarly, the proposal is for it to be approved for a time limit of 2 years. It will then need to be reviewed by council again at that time to see if it is appropriate in this area, if there have been issues resulting from it being placed in this site. In terms of safety, I did take a look at East Parade, and yes, it is 4 lanes of traffic, but there is a significant median strip in the middle of East Parade, which will support access. So people do have to cross 2 lanes of traffic travelling in a north-westerly direction, and then 2 lanes of traffic travelling in a south-easterly direction. I think I got that wrong way, but anyway. But that traffic flow is only in one direction when they're crossing the road. I would consider there's a number of other streets across the city and throughout Western Australia that are much more dangerous to cross over. The ones that don't have a median strip in the middle where you're trying to cross effectively 4 or more lanes of traffic without a safe refuge in the middle. And in particular, that median strip is quite significant in size as well, so that people can safely get to that spot and then they have time to then cross over from there. The final point was whether this is appropriate in this space. It is a discretionary item for council to consider this. I think it is appropriate in this space. There is good access to it because of public transport. It is using a facility that's currently disused. The hours of operation, particularly between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m, mean that it's going to have a reduced impact on the residents there. Having it during the day, not at night, helps to address some of the safety issues that people have raised as well. As such, I am supportive of the officer recommendation. Thank you. Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think the location is unique. Yes, it is within the commercial zone. It sits directly opposite residential properties. So whilst it is in itself within the commercial zone, and that needs to be considered in terms of its planning location in the real world, it does sit directly opposite residential properties. So there are issues that are legitimately of concern there. The safety issue, I think that the fact that you have a designated exit from a train station directly across the road from Bramwell Street, and as Councillor Loden has indicated, whilst there are 4 lanes of traffic and it is a busy and probably or potentially poorly managed road in terms of the accessibility on foot, I don't think that that's a reason. You could make the same argument throughout that commercial zone, and effectively anybody who didn't provide 100% of their car parking and access on site would then potentially be subject to the same concern, because people do rely on the location and proximity to the train station for access. So that I don't accept that as a reason not to approve this development. The key issue for me is the management plan or the lack of it currently. Actually, I will speak briefly to the car parking requirement as well. The only reason that I would be of any mind to support this application, given its proposed car parking and access, is because of the hours that are proposed. I think that 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. in the day does significantly mitigate that impact, but it is certainly, if you look at the documentation that's provided, it is openly reliant on almost all of the available car parking that is within the area. I think that without knowing the specifics of the users of the shopfront facility, I would assume there would be a number that would arrive by alternative means, but also plenty of people who would either arrive by taxi, be dropped off or otherwise. And I think that the need for close parking over those 4 hours would be intensive, but I do think that those are, it's certainly in a commercial zone, reasonable hours for there to be an increase in activity, regardless of the use. The issue of the management plan is significant to me. I think that people sometimes either perceive these, real or otherwise, to be a document that is provided that provides some broad lip service, perhaps, to the local authority. But we certainly have plenty of experience in Vincent of services of these nature having an impact, and particularly where it is a drop-in service and not something that is either by appointment or. This is the second week we've been told about the comparisons to Church Street, which is a vastly different facility where people are brought there by, as my understanding, either police officers or people from the facility will pick up at-risk adolescents and bring them to the facility. That is a known way of people arriving and a known number, and is something that is controllable by its very nature, a drop-in centre or facility. The service that it provides, nobody knows on any day if there's 35 or 150 people turning up. So I think that the management plan and how that impacts upon the surrounding neighbourhood is something that is critical, and we do have on-the-ground evidence of issues where management plans haven't covered potential for what to do with people either after they leave or if they are denied access for one reason or another, whether it be numbers or otherwise. We do have current live issues elsewhere in the city with similar sorts of services being provided by not-for-profits, and I will actually ask a question. I know that it was asked at the briefing last week for the management plan, or a brief version to be provided. Was that asked of the applicant? Was there any conversation about the management plan, other than their clear acceptance of the need for it? Was there any attempt to provide something in the last week? Sorry, through you to the Director, Madam.
Through you, Mayor Cole. Yes, the request was made to the applicant, and they in fact provided their Maylands management plan. That will provide a guide to council as to what to expect in terms of a management plan for this site, but it would need to be obviously modified to account for local conditions. If you look at attachment 4, it does refer to what occurs if there is a need to move people on. There's a warning system and an escalation of response.
So, I mean, I guess for me, the issue, the difference between the current operation in Maylands, it is in a town centre zone, and it is not directly adjacent to residential properties. I think that whilst that activity is centred around the middle of the day, which generally speaking is of less risk, I do think that it is fair for us as decision makers and for the community to expect to have an understanding of how that impact is going to be properly mitigated. So I will wait to hear the debate, and I do also understand that whilst we're inside the statutory timeframes, that there are property purchase decisions that hinder on timings, and so not seeking to delay or defer the item unnecessarily, but it is, for me, something that is critical, that is a missing piece in the puzzle in terms of my decision, but I will listen to the debate.
Thank you, Councillor Toppelberg. Councillors? Councillor Harley?
I want to speak to the item and support the officer's recommendation. I've heard what the mover and seconder have had to say. I don't share some of those concerns. The organisation has operated in Maylands. I guess I'm not sure if the officers sought any information from the Maylands Council as to whether there'd been any. Pardon? No. Okay. Thank you, Councillor Castle. So there'd been no complaints that had been registered. I'm just advised it is operating between 10 and 2. If this was a night service, I would have a different slant on it, because there are other issues that arise with night services, because there's a different clientele as well that access night services versus day services. Predominantly, their clientele are the elderly and single parents, and they're certainly two demographics who are very vulnerable and often don't have specific services provided. So I think it's a positive thing that it's moving into the city of Vincent. It adds to our the range of services that we provide in this type of way. So I think that's a positive thing. There are obviously complaint mechanisms in place if any nearby residents are experiencing difficulties, whether it be parking or whether there be antisocial behaviour. In terms of the staffing, I note that there's a director, full-time director, 2 Christian brothers on site, a part-time worker, as well as a range of volunteers. So it certainly sounds like they have adequate staffing in place. So I just want to support the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Harley. Councillors? Councillor Konchevsky?
Thank you, Mayor. I think from my perspective, I think this is an intensification of the use of the site. And I accept that most people would be accessing the site between 10 and 2, and that probably does go quite a way to limiting the impact on the broader community surrounding the site. I think from my perspective, I think potentially that the impacts could likely be reduced by potentially limiting the number of people on site at any one time. And I note from the report that it talks about, a likelihood of, 15 people potentially attending each hour of the service, and that they'd limited the number of clients on site to 50. I still think that's probably quite high in relation to managing access to and exiting from the facility if you had and parking. I note that the management plan from the Mayland site essentially says that no one drives to the site aside from the volunteers and the staff members, and I think I'm more likely to accept that would be the case in the Maylands location. I'm not sure that this location would actually experience the same treatment in terms of access. And so I think that I feel that the current approach to parking management, which essentially says that no one will arrive by car, but doesn't actually necessarily give specific reference to how those clients would be counselled around their parking options, public transport options, etc., through their induction to the site. I don't necessarily feel it's sufficient in this regard, and I also I feel that the current management plan is a little light on the detail around how clients will be managed out of the facility if there is inappropriate behaviour, if they've been banned or if they are observed to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. I absolutely recognise that this is unlikely to be a frequent occurrence, but particularly given the concerns that have been raised from within the gallery and from the residents surrounding the site, I think that it would be reasonable that the management plan contains specific reference to this. So I think probably from my perspective, or maybe I'll just do it. I'd like to put forward an amendment to modify recommendation 1.3 to state that a maximum of 40 people are permitted on the site at any one time, being comprised of 4 full-time staff, 6 volunteers and 30 visitors. If I can get a seconder.
Is there a seconder for the motion, for the amendment? Seconded, Councillor Hallett.
Thank you, Councillor Hallett. Look, I think this just, in terms of the parking, this would go some way to, I think, alleviating my concerns around the operation of the facility and its likely impact. I recognise it's a time-limited approval. There's obviously opportunity for review, and based on my assessment of the submission from the applicant, it certainly would not appear, on the basis of the way the facility is likely to be used, to have a significant impact, but just may potentially require a bit more attention as to how people will be managed into accessing and exiting the facility.
Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. Look, I do support the amendment just in terms of, as this service is establishing in the area, and it can be reviewed quite soon, I think it would be fine to have a slightly smaller number. We can monitor it closely and then see if there's any broad parking implications. If that's not the case and it is predominantly public transport use, great, and perhaps it could be increased again at the next review.
Councillors, Councillor Loden.
A question through the Chair to Director of Development Services. Has there been any conversation with the applicant around numbers of participants at this site? Or whether or not 50, why was 50 specifically identified versus, say, 30?
Through you, Mayor Cole, no conversations that I'm particularly aware of, but I would suggest it would be a function of the size of the premises and that they could reasonably fit that number of people and have justified or have sought to justify the parking provision accordingly, but no particular conversations with the applicant.
Anything further, Councillor Loden? Councillor Harley?
Thank you. I don't support the amendment, particularly given there's been no discussion with the service provider. I'm not aware of what their operating model is. I'm not aware of where they get their funding from, whether it is client-connected funding. I just don't have that information in front of me, and I feel that it could have been 10, 20, 30, 40. It feels arbitrary to me. Just looking at the parking management plan, there are 81 bays within 200 metres of that site. So let's put aside the train station and the fact that people may cycle, walk there or be dropped off. And that is not uncommon for people accessing services of this nature, that they do not have vehicles, that they actually get dropped off by other service providers, or that they make their own way there and they use public transport. So I totally accept that that in Maylands there seemed not to have been any problems. I just don't think that was just because of Maylands, because the clients would come from a range of places. So I just don't expect that all these clients are turning up in cars. There are 81 bays in the area. There's 30 one-hour parking bays. There's 27 two-hour parking bays and 24 parking bays with no time restrictions at all. So people could come and park there and walk into work if they wanted to. Probably do, actually. And I noted that there was a survey done as well, and actually the car park usage in that area seemed to be quite low. So there seemed to be a lot of parking bays in that area based on the survey. So if parking's the main issue, I just don't think that's an acceptable reason to knock a service down where they're providing a service to a number of clientele, which we as a group of decision makers don't know whether they're funded to provide that, whether that's always been their service level and they're dropping it to come here, or whether they're increasing it. I don't have that information in front of me, and I support the motion in the way that the officers have presented it, so I don't support the amendment.
Councillors? It's an interesting proposal. I take the points of all councillors who've spoken on the amendment, and the consideration of funding allocation and how the services is run is a valid point that Councillor Harley raises. I guess my thoughts in relation to this application are that I would have liked to have seen a a management plan come forward in advance, and I am speaking to the amendment in that I think that would then go to how the number of people are managed. I am open to a lower number of people, but I do take Councillor Harley's point that we don't actually have a good understanding of how that would affect the operation of the service, and I think that the questions I have would perhaps be better served through deferral and request for a detailed management plan, which I think is really where we are lacking information in regard to this development application. Are there any further comments on the amendment? Okay, I'll put it. All those in favour of the amendment? All those against? I declare it lost. We're back to the substantive. Further comments?
I'd like to move a deferral.
Is there a seconder for the procedural motion to move a deferral?
A deferral for 1 month to allow the provision of a management plan specific to the location with specific reference to parking management and access to the management of clients and access to the site, and then all the other reasons that were written in the motion as currently presented.
Is there a seconder for the procedural motion for deferral? Seconded by Councillor Toppelberg. I'll put it to the vote. All those in favour? All those against? I declare that lost. We're back to the substantive motion. Is there any further debate on this item? Okay, I'll put it. All those in favour? All those against? I declare it carried, with Councillor Toppelberg and Councillor Gontaszewski voting against. Okay, that takes us to item 11.1, licence to Exponos Proprietary Limited for alfresco structure within Road Reserve, Units 3 and 4, 177 Stirling Street, Perth, Bricker Bar. Can I have a mover and seconder for this item, please? Moved Councillor Toppelberg, seconded Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. Sorry, I'm just going to scoot through to it. Sorry, just give me one moment. Okay. So I know the officer's recommendation has changed. I do understand there are some amendments coming. I do support the officer recommendation as it is. I'll speak to the likely amendments as they are moved. I will just ask a question of the Director of Corporate Services, if I may, through you, and that relates to both the term and the licence. Can you just confirm, I did receive a phone call today that indicated that the discussion both with the City and Department of Lands from the applicant's perspective took approximately 12 months to be able to get to a point where there was something that was presented to council, and there's concern, I understand, from the owner, about the length of the term, that the 5 years is reasonable given the protracted negotiations. But there was also there were some questions asked about potential assignment of the licence in the event of the sale of the business. So because I know I did speak to the director today, but thought I'd ask the question now. So the question that was asked of me is if the business is sold but continues to operate in the same way, so that the business doesn't change, but the company that owns the business does change, how is that assignable? And if we can just get some comments from the director, that would be appreciated.
Through you, Mayor Cole, we have looked into this. The current licence doesn't allow for assignment of the lease, but we have drafted an amendment today that would allow for the licence to be assigned subject to the consent of the city. So that could certainly be an amendment that we can consider. So,
if I'm correct, that's the amendment which is on. I did see it before. The orange. Sorry. So, can I just ask, the way that that's worded, it's almost a double negative. Should it not read the licensee? Oh, sorry, it's removing the words "not." You just can't see it on the orange. That's my eyesight. Perfect. I'll move the amendment on the orange, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Toppelberg. Seconded Councillor Gontaszewski had a hand in the air first. Thank you.
So in a roundabout way, that just makes sense. I think that there's a fairness principle involved, particularly as the Department of Lands doesn't seem to be too interested in these sorts of discussions, and in the event that there was a potential sale of the business for the new owner to potentially have to go through that same process seems to be overly... but I do note, and did make the comment to the owner today, that if it wasn't the same business, if it was just somebody taking over the premises and being a business run in a different style, and the nature of the activity in that outdoor area was to potentially change, that would, which is covered by this amendment, but that would then potentially be subject to a no from the city. So I think that's important that we retain that right in case the promises don't match the reality on the ground in the event of an assignment.
Sorry, where were we at? Councillor Loden. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I support the officer recommendation. I do have an amendment, though, which I would like to move, which is... Oh, we haven't voted. Oh,
no, we're
sorry,
still
I
at
thought
the
we
amendment.
voted.
So Councillor Gondaszewski was seconding. You wish to forfeit your right. Councillor Loden, do you wish to speak to the amendment? Sorry, are there any further comments? I'll put the amendment on the orange. All those in favour? All those have carried. Thank you. We're back to the substantive. Councillor Loden.
I'll try again. Sorry about that. So I support the officer recommendation. However, I do have an amendment which I would like to move, which is on the green. The concern I have is this is the first licence that we've done for a permanent alfresco. Sorry? Do I have to explain it? Yeah?
I just want to, first before you start debating, is there a seconder for the amendment on the green? Councillor Gondaszewski.
Okay. Try again. The reason for this proposed amendment is this is the first time, to my understanding, that we've had a permanent alfresco structure within the city, and I think we need to do some further thought about how we want to manage this going forwards. Currently, non-permanent alfrescos are free within the city. We haven't really decided if a permanent alfresco would be free or we would charge a fee. Effectively, the department picked $2,000 and then we increased it at CPI and continued that $2,000. That seems to be low to me, but I think we need to have a discussion at council to do this, to actually figure out how we want to do that, and it would seem that adopting it within the fees and charges would be a good way to do that for this and any other future developments that come along that would like to have a permanent alfresco structure in place. And that would be something that we would consider as part of the budget process and then land on where this would sit. 2 years, because if we don't figure it out by the end of this financial year, then we've still got another year to figure out how we deal with the issue. Thank you.
Councillors, Councillor Gondaszewski, do you wish to speak to the amendment?
She said no, but I'll speak. Just a question.
Councillor Tuppelberg.
Question through you. So when this originally came to council many years ago, my understanding is the reason the Department of Lands were involved was because there was anchoring of, obviously, the supporting structure, that there was actually anchoring which was going to be in the ground, but if it was just an encroachment, so if the roof structure was self-supporting, that the Department of Lands wouldn't have been involved and wouldn't have been subject to this licence, but it's only because there is actually structure that is required to be supported and in the ground, and effectively the Department of Lands required a licence or a lease arrangement over the posts because they were in the ground. Am I correct in that?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct. It's because of the posts permanently affixed to the ground. That's why a licence is required.
So I guess it's the only difference between any. So it's got nothing to do with a licence for alfresco. This has to do with the posts being in the ground, which to me doesn't relate to an alfresco fee or the permanency of the structure. For me, alfresco is completely separate to what is being requested. If you look at the amenity that it actually provides, if we banned alfresco and removed all of the tables and chairs, it actually provides an amenity benefit in that particular location. So from my perspective, I'm comfortable that I'd actually would be comfortable with no licence fee. I don't understand the benefit of the fee in terms, unless there is monitoring required, so it comes at a cost to us. But that amount has been set or agreed, and I think the CPI increase is reasonable. But as a principle, the idea of a covered outdoor alfresco area, the idea of trying to we've spent 3 years getting rid of an alfresco fees in this council, to look at it and say, well, because it's potentially permanent, the only permanent element that makes this different is, I think, 8 or 9 posts that are concreted into the ground. The rest of it is something that would be otherwise acceptable, so I won't support the amendment on that basis.
Councillors, Councillor Loden, this is your amendment which you've spoken to. Asking a question? Sure.
Theoretically, could council resolve for the fee to be $0?
Through you, Mayor Cole, theoretically that could be done as part of the budget process.
Councillor Murphy?
Yeah, look, I understand the intent of what Councillor Loden's trying to do, but just further on from what Councillor Toppelberg was talking about, I think to have us assess the fees for essentially a lease is probably going to be untenable to the applicant, because we could decide next year that we want to make it $20,000 or we could make it $0, and that's just not really how you go into a lease. So I'm sort of not sure if I can support this or not on that basis. Not sure what that means, but anyway.
Some more thinking time. Councillor Harley, do you wish to speak?
No, I'm a little bit. I'm a little bit confused between the licence fee. I do recall. Sorry, I do recall the issue with the permanent posts, etc. I guess what I'm asking is, a Bricker wanting to have this as an ongoing permanent alfresco, and therefore we have no rights over a say over what happens on that land. Is that the outcome that Bricker are seeking? Director? Through the chair?
Through you, Mayor Cole, Bricker is certainly looking for some certainty about the future, and that would be one of the reasons that we'd be looking at a longer licence term.
Sorry, a licence or an alfresco licence? So we've just got the issue to do with the posts, which are a licence issue for permanent structure versus a permanent alfresco. So just want to understand.
Through you, Mayor Cole. So the alfresco permit is separate, so this report only relates to the licence. So the licence is governing the location of the posts within the road reserve. They have to apply for an alfresco permit separately. Was that your question?
Yeah, so we'd be saying that the posts would stay there on a permanent basis, basically, for 5 years.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes. The posts are already located there, and the licence term would be 5 years, and the licence would provide that they'd need to remove the posts at the end of the licence term. So,
yeah, I don't have a problem with that. So can I get some direction about what the hell I'm voting on here to achieve that outcome? Because
we're looking at the amendment on the green, which is to change the term from 5 years to 2 years with the 3-year option, and then that then talks about looking at fee adopted by the city for permanent alfresco structures within the road reserve as included in the city's schedule of fees and charges as amended. So it's about introducing a fee for a permanent alfresco within our fees and charges.
So the two issues have been conflated. Yeah? Okay, I get it. Thank you.
Councillor Hallett.
Just a question through the Mayor to the Director. How many of these circumstances do we have throughout the city, or is this the only one?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we do have the Flying Scotsman they have a similar structure, so we're looking at how we can manage that at the moment, but this is the only al fresco like structure at the moment that we're currently looking to grant a licence in respect to.
Councillors? Councillor Hallett?
Can I just ask a further question?
Is that a follow-up question, Councillor Hallett? I'll just go to Councillor Hallett first as his follow-up questions. I'll come back to you.
Sorry, Councillor Toppelberg. I understand that the reason in the amendment is not, I guess, part of the amendment itself, but there's a comment there around allocating money to Public Open Space Reserve. What would that actually look like, and how could we keep admin to do that without it actually being part of the amendment?
Through you, Mayor Cole, transfer to reserves, if that is a council decision, is fairly straightforward and is very transparent in terms of our record keeping processes. Does that answer your question?
I think we do need to just stipulate that we don't currently have an open space reserve. It is a recommendation in a matter that we're considering this evening. Councillors? Councillor Gontaszewski?
I can appreciate the sentiment. I'm not supportive. Let me just clarify. In terms of may I ask a question through you, Mayor Cole? In terms of other potential future permanent structures or semi-permanent structures such as these, the intent is that there would be a licence, an individual licence for each of those that would allow the city, should there not be a dedicated fee, to determine on an individualised basis what any licence fee going forward.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct at this point in time.
I think given that we don't have a large number of these sorts of licences, and my preference would always be to actually assess each on its individual merit and have and probably decide on an appropriate licence fee, and I guess without necessarily knowing what permanent al fresco structure fee, how that could actually look. I don't think I can support this amendment. I'm happy with the way it was written.
Councillors? Councillor Toppelberg?
Just a further question. I note the comment about the Flying Scotsman, but is the permanency of the structure considered to be the fact that the posts aren't removable, or would the same rules apply to some businesses that potentially have clear pull-down blinds that have fixings in the ground that they affix to an awning, so where the posts are potentially removable, but they do have a permanent structure on the ground that they then utilise to effectively commandeer what is currently public space?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's only if the posts are actually affixed to the ground, so blinds that can be moved up, that a licence won't be required in those instances. And the same with planter boxes and those kind of things that can be moved away without any actual having to remove them from being affixed to the ground.
Just one other question, just in relation to the linking of the al fresco potentially to the structure. There's nothing in the recommendation as it stands without this amendment that precludes council from not allowing al fresco on site, charging per seat, charging per square metre, limiting the number of seats, etc. There's nothing in relation to the al fresco permit system we currently have or any future policy that's impacted at all by the approval of the structure or the recommendation as it stands. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct. The al fresco permit is dealt with separately.
Councillors? Councillor Vatakis?
Through you, Mayor Cole, to Director of Corporate Services. Just with regards to the exercising that option, are there any additional costs to the city with breaking that term down into two separate terms?
In terms of the preparation of a deed of assignment of licence, the usual terms in the licence would be that any deed of assignment would be prepared by the city's solicitors at the cost of the licensee. So there would be no additional cost for the city.
Councillors? I don't support the amendment. I think that what we're dealing with here is a licence for permanent structure. As the officers have explained, this permanent alfresco fee is something I think that is separate. And secondly, because we have been through a process where we have done away with fees for alfresco, I don't support a new fee for a permanent structure alfresco. I think that really negates what we have tried to do with removing fees for alfresco. This business is located on World Square, where we do have issues from time to time, and I think that this alfresco really brings that sort of outdoor vibrancy, surveillance, etc. to the area, and has been a really good addition to the area. So I don't wish to hinder that by potentially placing additional fees and charges on that, and I'd be supporting the officer recommendation. Any further comments on the amendment? Okay, I'll put it. All those in favour? Oh, sorry. I'll do it again. All those in favour? All those against? I declare it lost. We're back to the substantive. Councillors, any further comments on the substantive? Councillor Murphy?
Got a quick question through the chair. Just around setting a precedent for the licensing of other alfresco areas. I'm not sure exactly how to frame the question, but would if us approving this, would this mean that would this open the door for other licensed premises to apply for licensed areas in the alfresco areas, in the current alfresco areas, in parklets and whatnot?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, if other applicants want to have permanent structures or like veranda posts, canopy structures within the road reserve, then they would also need to apply for a licence.
Sorry, a liquor licence.
I think that's a separate issue, Councillor Murphy, and one that's dealt with by Racing, Gaming and Liquor. Any further comments in relation to the substantive? Councillor Toppelberg? Would anyone like to speak before Councillor Toppelberg closes debate? Over to you, Councillor Toppelberg.
I love our overly courteous code of conduct that we have these days, or meeting procedures. I will just make a brief comment, because I was familiar with some of the early discussions that went on, and I think part of this is not being driven by the city, being driven by the Department of Lands and their desire to have a licence over what is literally 700 mil posts. And this is the second time it's come before council, but this has been an extensive process. But I think that about what that structure provides, irrespective of what's sitting under it currently, what that provides on is unique to that site, unique to the corner. Mayor Cole spoke about its proximity to World Square, but also if you look at that width of that footpath, it's literally on a roundabout. I think that whilst the planters that have been provided by the current tenant and current business add to the area, I actually think that the addition of that structure, if you look at everything from the 24-hour McDonald's, which was initially opposed by council and made its way through the SAT process, through to some of the development in and around that corner and some of the goings-on in World Square, I think that it actually provides an amenity on its own, regardless of the operation of Bricker underneath it. I think that the structure itself is something that is in itself unique, and unlike some of the concern that's been raised, I don't have any issue with people coming and wanting to pursue similar outcomes. I think that site-specific circumstances would mean that there would be very few that would benefit in the same way that this site has benefited in terms of providing not only the physical structure but that occupation of space and amenity within it.
That closes debate, so I'll put the item. All those in favour? I declare it carried unanimously. Okay, item 11.2, statutory review of the City of Vincent's wards, not awards, although we have received a few of those lately, wards and representation. Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. I just brought this up just to note that the changes since it was last before council, rather than letting it go through en bloc. The bit in red on page 192 is the important bit, which refers to examples rather than options, and I think that that's the critical change that we've made. And just to, I suppose, state publicly that the option of no change exists for anybody, but if people either see any of these options as viable or any other options that they may have, they're free to submit them, and that reads quite differently to what we had before us at the last meeting. And thank you to the officers for indulging council and reaching something that I think is far more apt to go out to our community.
Thank you, Councillor Toppelberg. Any further comments in relation to this item? I'll put it. All those in favour? Declare it carried unanimously. Thank you. That takes us to item 12.4, Tennis West proposal for Robertson Park, Fitzgerald Street, Perth. Can I have a mover and seconder, please? Moved Councillor Gonchevsky, seconded Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. I'm supportive of this. It's obviously fairly preliminary at this stage. I note that there is an amendment on the yellow in relation to coming back to council in February.
Councillor Gonchevsky, my sincere apologies. I just need to check with 11.2. Was there a seconder for that item? I'm just trying to... Councillor Harley? Councillor Harley, we have as the seconder for 11.2.
Back to the video, Ref.
I didn't second.
I can check the video.
No trouble.
Sorry, Councillor Gonchevsky, I do apologise.
I didn't second it.
Thank you. So go ahead.
No, look, I'm happy to move this. Would like to move the amendment on the yellow, if the seconder is
have a
happy with
seconder for the amendment on the yellow. Councillor Hallett.
Yeah. The amendment just requires that after there's some consultation, this will come back to us before being fed back to Tennis West, which I think is appropriate. But other than that, I'm supportive of the recommendation.
Councillor Hallett, do you wish to speak to the amendment? Councillors, any comments? I will just comment to say that I think that this is a reasonable proposition for Robertson Park to become a shortlisted site for the State Tennis Centre, and I do think that it is important that we understand the feedback from residents to not only test the sentiment but also to respond to the feedback raised, so that if this proposal does go forward, that if there are concerns or issues raised, that we're fully aware of them and able to mitigate those. So I think this is an important step in the process. Any further comments on the amendment? I'll put it. All those in favour? Thank you. Back to the substantive. Any further comments? I'll put it. All those in favour? I declare the item carried unanimously. That takes us to item 13.2, Information Bulletin. Moved Councillor Loden, seconded Councillor Gonchevsky.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The reason why I pulled this one out was just because we didn't have the development statistics in the report last week, and I had a question that I wanted to ask around that. Just noting that the number of development applications that we have in the system is relatively static over the last 4 months. Part of the reason why this reporting is there is so that we can keep an eye, I guess, and get a sense that those number of outstanding applications are tracking down, and that has tracked down over the last 2 years progressively. But I guess my concern is that it has formed a somewhat static number, and that number seems to me to be higher than what is acceptable to our community. And so I wanted to understand if that is something that we're expecting to continue at that level, that number of applicants sitting there, or if there is a need to allocate additional resources for assessing development applications when we start getting into budget time next year.
Through you, Mayor Cole, Councillor Loden's observations are correct in terms of the statistics effectively plateauing in recent times. That before that plateau, there was a meaningful improvement in terms of processing times as well, and also the breakdown of the average determination time. That has reached, with the current resources and the current applications being lodged, that's reached, I suppose, the extent of any meaningful improvement we could make without changing the status quo. the draft workforce plan does foreshadow additional resources being allocated to the development and design team. If that did materialise to the budget process, that would certainly allow further improvement to those statistics.
Councillor Loden. Councillors, any comments? Councillor Hallett and then Councillor Harley.
Just a question in relation to the street tree removal requests. Through the Mayor to the Director of Engineering. The fourth tree down that is small and is not growing and is being replaced with the jacaranda. Can you just comment on why jacaranda's been chosen? It doesn't look like there's any other jacarandas in the street, so I'm wondering what the street matrix would have provided.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I can't answer that right now, so if I can take that question on notice, I'll prepare something and send it out.
Councillor Harley?
Just note we have a 90% dead tree on one of our streets, which is a bit sad, isn't it? My question is related to parking. The information bulletin about the infringements issued by offence. I'm wanting to know where the stats are in regards to how many parking offences or infringement offences, I beg your pardon, were withdrawn, and the table telling us why they were withdrawn and how many.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's not included in this particular information bulletin, but certainly information we're happy to include in the information bulletin at the December council meeting.
May I ask that be included on an ongoing basis? It did provide, my apologies, I've dropped the ball on this, I've been focused on other things, but it did actually provide a really good QA process and I guess a discussion point about the reasons why infringements are reversed, and I think it provided a level of transparency in terms of understanding why our officers are reversing infringements as well, and it helped keep us all focused on the reason for that, because it's a significant loss of revenue once we start reversing infringements. The cost that it was to, the cost involved in issuing infringement, the costs involved then in reversing the infringement, many of which occur following the point of issue back in the admin building. And part of that report is to know whether any of those infringements that were issued that have been reversed belong to staff or councillors.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, we certainly still track all of that data, so providing that to council for transparency purposes isn't a problem, and I'll make sure it's included in the December bulletin as well as on a regular basis.
Councillors, any further comments or questions in relation to the information bulletin? Okay, I'll put that report. All those in favour of the motion? Declare it carried. That takes us to item 13.3, an absolute majority decision required on the appointment of an alternate member for Mindarie Regional Council on the 6th of December 2018. Can I have a mover? Councillor Toppelberg, seconded Councillor Gontaszewski.
I'd like to nominate Councillor Joshua Toppelberg to attend in your place.
Thank you so much, Councillor Toppelberg. I'll just better check if there are any other nominees to see if we need to cause an election.
I was nominated by telephone at about 4 o'clock this afternoon, I'll have you know.
It looks like you have the full support of council, and I'm delighted to inform you that that's taking place at Cambridge, and that some of the council members have requested a Christmas fair at dinner. That was a topic of discussion. And also I'm happy to brief you, and we also have Director of Engineering, I believe, will be in attendance, and myself and Director will make ourselves available to brief you prior to the meeting. So thank you. That's the night where we have 4 meetings / events happening on the one night. So a busy night for council. I'll put it. All those in favour? I declare it carried. Okay, that takes us to item 14.1, late item, notice of motion, Councillor Joshua Toppelberg, policy number 3.8.12, mobile food vendor. I think it's supposed to be with vendors. Can I have a mover?
I will move it, but I will move clause 1, 1.1 and 3.
Just bear
So
with
I'll
me for
leave 1.2
second.
and I'll leave 1.2 and 2, and we'll do so by amendment shortly. So I'm effectively moving the deletion of the location of location 1 and the initiating the review, and I'll deal with the other part separately.
Sorry, can you just say
So
you're
moving-
leaving...
You know, I'll move the whole lot, and if someone wants to remove it, they can delete it.
Right, okay. We have it moved by Councillor Toppelberg. Is there a seconder for this notice of motion? Seconded Councillor Murphy.
Thank you. This matter was brought to my attention by a nearby resident who had issue with a particular vendor, but it prompted me to go back and read the policy. And I think when I read the policy, I remember it's from its early incarnation was essentially a battle at the time, or an effort at the time between administration and council to try and get the flavour of what we were trying to achieve. Right, we received a first draft that was something that was quite bureaucratic and was talking about very much about licensing and fees and what can and can't be done. My sense is that what we ended up with was a policy that was not only opening our arms, but also was actually having potential detrimental impact commercially. And I will make it clear that this is not about targeting any particular vendor or mobile food vendor or operator, but the current situation that we have in this location in Hyde Park is, more so as an example, is and encouraged by the policy. So there is no question that the applicant, that the operator of this particular food van is not only acting within the policy but within its intent, encouraged to provide seating. So I was there on Sunday and there were 4 low tables, each with 4 or 5 milk crates around as seats. So effectively you've got a cafe for free in the middle of a park where we're presenting on sunny days thousands of patrons and able to operate there 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. The issue that has aggrieved the neighbour that got in contact with me was firstly the intensity, and so the fact that it is all day every day. There's some noise issues that they have in relation to the generator, and that's not. I'm certain it's one of those situations that the technical noise impact would not trigger us to demand the generator be turned off, but the all-day, everyday impact of it, particularly for somebody who wants to either sleep in the morning or to go to bed early in the evenings, it's something that they hear and are conscious of. And the other amenity issue they referred to was the visual impact that they have, that it detracts from their view to the lake. In talking about that specific zone, for me, so I'll talk at the moment about item 1.1. This doesn't preclude anyone from operating within Hyde Park. All it says is that on that grassed area that is effectively raised, that sits on the southwestern corner, whilst the policy is under review, and I'll talk to 1.2 in a moment, but whilst the policy is under review and people are allowed 14 hours a day and are encouraged to bring tables, chairs, etc., for me personally, as a pop-up or as a something different or an event or a short period of time or specific days, I think that's a reasonable intensification of activity within a park. I think that the commercialisation and the effective not only allowance but encouragement of a rent-free cafe, outdoor cafe to be set up in a park is certainly not what Hyde Park is about for me, but it's certainly not something that I think we should be actively encouraging, particularly in an environment that has seen the nearest provider of coffee, cakes and other assorted goodies just around the corner having closed, presumably not because they were making too much money, but a bricks and mortar business within probably 150 metres of that site has recently closed. And I think that it sends a mixed message in terms of our desire for activation or a desire for activity and providing amenity to actually having commercial impact. So for me, I think that the simplest way to deal with that in the short term is the deletion of location 1. I understand the officer's comments. I'd have an issue with us having, as a council or as a city, having a sympathy for people who have a licence over a 12-month period where the policy specifically says that pretty much at any time we can change our minds about it, over and above ratepayers who have a permanent long-term commitment or occupiers who are adjacent to. So whilst it deals with this area specifically in terms of recommendation or the clause 1.1, the other critical thing is that we do review the policy and make sure it is in line with both our expectations and our intent in terms of the community. Clause 1.2, I do accept that people will have made commercial decisions on the basis that the policy does allow them currently to be there for extended periods of time. I do think that there is some, whether it be merit or that the fact that somebody is in a mobile food van, they can pick that up and move to another location either within the city or even within that reserve and still be in line with the policy. I think that I don't think it was ever the intent of the policy to have someone setting up potentially 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. I think that 5 hours in the one day in the same zone I think that's fair, but I do accept an argument that people have made potentially commercial decisions based on our policy and that licence expires and we're heading into the summer season and those licences expire at the end of June, so I don't know whether that clause will survive, but that's well and truly my 5 minutes, I'm sure, too. So I seek your support to, I think, make a reasonable change to a policy that I think is unduly lenient towards commercial operations in our parks.
Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, look, thanks, Councillor Toppelberg. In principle and in general, I'm supportive of a review of the food truck policy. Though, with respect, I think it's possibly a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to a resident complaint. I haven't heard of any complaints from any residents or anyone from about our food truck policy in the 4 years that we've had it, personally. I think that if we were to, if I was to support a notice on motion for a review of this policy, I would be seeking more objective consultation and with a view to try and get a balanced report back. So, it would be great to know the current use of the food trucks, how many people currently use them in Vincent, who are they, where are they from, do they impact surrounding businesses, or maybe they would support surrounding businesses. Often such activations can support local businesses, not hinder. What can council do to mitigate the impact to residents? Do we provide power? How can we better manage? How can we better manage it? I think it's probably a little bit more to consider than just perhaps putting a blanket or putting a couple of blanket rules in and then kind of seeing it as a negative. So I probably wouldn't support this at all. I would support a complete redraft, but happy to, flag at least removing points 1.1 and 1.2.
Thank you, Mayor.
Go ahead.
Just a point of order, just to ask a question. Is it easiest rather than to perhaps just seek to vote on each of the recommendations separately rather than potentially seeking to amend infinitely?
I'm happy to take a vote on Clause 1, Clause 2 and Clause 3 separately.
1.1 and 1.2 even separate as well?
Each.
That's okay?
Okay. Break it down as far as possible. Okay, we can do that.
Look, we haven't actually even really debated it, so I understand your concern, but I actually wholeheartedly support this notice of motion. I'll be on the record to say I have no sympathy at all with vendors who've made business decisions based on a policy which is subject to councillor decision-making, amendments and changes. I don't think it's acceptable that a vendor spends 14 hours a day in Hyde Park. I wasn't overly keen to see this level of street vendors in Hyde Park. I sat through the consultation the community consultation, Hyde Park was one of the key areas. It was a bit of a battleground, actually, between the people who wanted to adapt Hyde Park to be, I felt, all things to all people. They wanted coffee vans, a whole range of things, through to the other end of people saying, why would you do that at Hyde Park? It's one of our most active parks. Our purpose was to try and activate areas that require activation, and Hyde Park on many weekends requires deactivation. You can't get car parking, there's weddings, there's probably funerals going on in there. I don't know what's going on, but it's an incredibly busy park, made more busy by Shoe Bakery, which actually had only just kind of started when we were talking about this. And if ever you've seen a bricks and mortar place activate a dead zone of a park, it's there. It is packed. And I like that model. I like our bricks and mortar people being able to bring that level of activation to our parks without them literally setting up a business. A lot of people use it, and I've been down there myself, and it's quite convenient, but it's really unsightly. And on the weekend I drove by, there wasn't actually a food vendor there at all, but what there was in that corner, pretty close to where that red zone is down on Glendale Street, there's a whole lot of families down there, so they were actually sitting in the space where the food vendor would have been. I support this notice of motion. I'm happy to vote on it one by one, and I'll be supporting each of these motions one by one. I think it is our right to let the vendors know the circumstances have changed, that there are issues. We had not envisaged vendors being down there that long, and I'd gladly go back to community consultation, because I actually think that the opposition to this actually may have strengthened, because I don't think people have enjoyed the level of activation that the street vendors have brought. I support kind of the coffee vans and the ice cream vans, which add a little bit of amenity, but so happy to... did somebody move an amendment to do these separated out, or...? All right, okay. Well, anyway, I support a notice of motion as is.
Councillors. Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. I do support the general intent of the motion, in particular, obviously reviewing the policy. I think that's really important. I also support removal of location 1 because of being adjacent to particularly those apartments right across the road, and also that being an open space that's I personally would think is much more useful for picnicking and individual and family use rather than vendors, versus the other space, which is far less enticing for that purpose. I'm open to removal of 1.2. I am sympathetic to the idea that we don't shift goalposts when the people have made planning decisions around what they're doing with their businesses. So I would support removal of 1.2, but otherwise I'd support the rest of the motion.
Councillors. Councillor Gontaszewski.
Just a question through you to the relevant director in relation to this item. Sorry. If we are talking about Zone 1, can I please ask, in relation to Clause 3.1.6 of the current policy, where given that there has been a concern raised by the community on the location of a mobile food vendor, whether the city has taken any action in relation to requiring the relevant vending operation to relocate?
Through you, Mayor Cole, based on the complaint received both through elected members and directly to city staff, administration have attended the site on numerous occasions and have found the vendor to be operating in accordance with the permit and the policy and not causing a noise nuisance relative to the noise regs. So staff have not requested the vendor from Area 1 to relocate.
And so just to confirm that there's been an assessment that the layout of the mobile vending operation, it does not compromise public access in this regard, or safety or circulation?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct.
Look, I can sort of understand why Zone 1, if you were to, what are they called, food truck rumbles? If you were going to have a food truck rumble down at Hyde Park, why you might do it in Zone 1, but I don't accept it as being appropriate for use perhaps at all, or certainly not for an extended period of time, where I believe that occupation of that zone by large food trucks or mobile food vendors would potentially compromise the use of the space as an open space, but also potentially line of sight for people wishing to maintain vision on children that may be using the playground, as well as other potential amenity issues associated with the use. I think if you look at the other locations of the food vendors at our other open spaces, they are generally very much on the periphery of the open space, where there is, this sort of does actually stick out as being, on the basis of my understanding and knowledge of the open spaces within the city, as plonking food trucks right in the middle of sort of peak picnic zone. So I would be supportive of the removal of Zone 1, but also pending a review of the policy as a whole, so that we can potentially get the balance between being able to use a space on occasions for rumbles and whatnot, but also preventing that sort of ongoing impact to amenity for park users and open space users.
Councillors, I'm going to speak largely in opposition to the majority of the notice of motion. I feel that this is the issue of the particular vendor in this location. I feel that this is something that we have grounds under our existing policy to deal with. We have several clauses in our mobile food vendor policy to deal with situation of amenity and appearance. We have a clause that talks about the ability to relocate a food van at the discretion of the City of Vincent. And we also have the ability to say no to things like signage that is not affixed to the vehicle. So I think there's plenty of provisions in here that allow us to deal with the particular issue of the van. I note that the Director of Engineering has highlighted on this piece of paper on the table a couple of other locations that may be more appropriate in that the van would be moved further from the road and from the line of sight of the street and surrounding residences. I think that in terms of reviewing the policy, I'm happy to do that on a holistic basis, but I think that to deal with this by removing an area and making changes to this particular location in this way without doing a more comprehensive review, I think it's unfair to the vendor. I note that the vendor is not aware that this notice of motion is coming forward. Currently we have 6 vendors operating within the City of Vincent, so we're not dealing with a large or catastrophic issue that requires immediate action, and where we do wish to have action taken, as I say, I believe the policy gives us the grounds to do so. I also think that the food vendor policy is not just about acts of activation but also about facility in our parks, and if you recall, we recently approved a concept plan for Axford Park that has a kiosk as part of that concept plan. So this idea of having kiosks is also something that we have discussed at Banks Reserve. It is something about provision of facility and actually giving people a place to have some food service where it's not sort of really in your face and overbearing. And I think, as I say, that this particular issue can be dealt with if there are current issues. So in terms of the motion before us, I don't support Clause 1 in terms of modifying the policy here and now, given that I believe our existing policy has measures in place to be able to deal with the issue of Area 1 and the van operating there. I don't support Clause 3.1, which talks about the Council's approach to the City's use of parks and reserves for commercial purposes, because I think that is at odds of our discussion around having kiosks as well as food trucks in our parks and reserves. Really, I guess the only part of the motion that I do support is initiating a review of the mobile food vendor policy, because I believe that does need to be comprehensive and consultative. And I think that 3.1 has a statement that is quite clear about cities, parks and reserves being used for commercial purposes that I don't believe that we've actually debated and discussed, and is at odds with some of our more recent decisions about what we have as facilities in our parks. So I think that this motion, as put, would be quite unfair to the existing operators within the City of Vincent, and I don't support taking this immediate action, and as I say, would really just support Clause 3 without the sub-clauses underneath it. So it may be that I am actually voting against this notice of motion, and I would ask that people do contemplate the impact that this does have on a vendor who is operating in accordance with our policy, and who can be dealt with within the existing policy that we have in place within the City of Vincent. Councillor Hallett.
Just a question to the Director. Through you, Mayor. The admin's already, I guess, gone out to check this particular vendor and decided not to move them. What criteria and information would you require to actually shift them, given that we can do that within our current policy?
Through you, Mayor Cole, given the existence of the permit and the, I suppose, current compliance with the permit and the policy, I suppose an approach or an issue that would need to be raised would likely be noise. If they're parking in the specified area, if they're not breaching any terms of the policy, in terms of tables, chairs, signage, music, food storage, etc. If the Area 1 is an area, if they move to the southern extent of that area closer to Glendower Street, the issue of noise might be exacerbated for the residents on the other side of the road. If a noise complaint was received, that would obviously be followed up, but in all other aspects of the vendor's operation, it would appear to be compliant with the permit and the policy.
Director, what about Clause 3.1.6 of the policy that states mobile food vending will not be supported where a vehicle size or layout may compromise public access, circulation, safety or other street activities if concerns are raised by a local business or the community on the operation or location of a mobile food vendor, the City may require the vending operation to relocate?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that is the current wording of provision 3.1.6. On each occasion the City staff have attended the site, the vehicle has been appropriately located inside the area. It hasn't been deemed to be obstructing access to the park, the playground, the lake, any other aspect of the park. It has occupied the area as mapped in Council's policy. But again, if there's specific concerns regarding this vendor and its compliance with 3.1.6, administration can certainly undertake further investigations.
Thank you. Chair, may I ask a question, please? Through you, Chair, to the Director. Would you, are you able to estimate from, well, first of all, if you could let me know how many times officers have been down there, just out of interest, and estimate how many square metres of that part of Hyde Park that particular vendor is taking up in compliance with the policy?
Through you, Mayor Cole, in terms of visits by City staff, I'd suggest since this issue was raised originally by the complainant directly to City staff, I would say collectively between 6 and 10 visits. Between 6 and 10 visits. And in terms of the area occupied, certainly not the whole area identified as Area 1. It is effectively a caravan with associated seating in the immediate surrounds. It is, on occasion where City staff have attended the site, it is the only vendor in Area 1. There's obviously Area 2 closer to the water, but in terms of Area 1, there has only ever been one vendor based on the City's recent visits. And I would suggest it occupies probably no more than a third or a quarter of that space.
Through you, Chair, to the Director, is it the same vendor on each of the 6 to 10 visits?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes.
Councillor Hallett?
Can I move an amendment to remove 1.2?
Can I have a seconder for the amendment? Councillor Murphy? Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Hallett?
I think it's been covered already.
Councillor Murphy, do you wish to speak to the amendment? Councillors? Councillor Loden?
Just a clarification, if we remove 1.2, wouldn't we also need to remove 2 as well? As it refers to 1.2?
Yes, that does make sense. Do you wish to move the deletion of 1.2 and clause 2, mover of the amendment?
Yes, please.
And seconder of the amendment, are you happy to second that? Thank you. Any comment on the amendment? Okay, I'll put it. All those in favour? Declare it carried. Oh, sorry. Councillor Harley voting against. Back to the substantive. Councillor Gondaszewski.
Would it be prudent to put forward an amendment to require that council to inform all current permit holders of the deletion of location 1 from Hyde Park? Or would that be just a matter of course?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it would certainly be open for council to add that back in, but even if it is not, it would absolutely be conveyed to the vendor.
So we're back to the substantive, but we are now dealing with 1.1 and clause 3, which has become clause 2, 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3. Is there further debate? Councillor Murphy, you have spoken as the seconder, so are you asking a question or moving an amendment?
Yeah, I'd like to move an amendment to delete 1.1.
Okay, is there a seconder for that? Councillor Fotakis. Councillor Murphy, do you wish to speak to it?
Yeah, look, I just feel that we need to look at this a little more closely. I want a bit more information before making such a decision and upsetting the apple cart, as they say. So I would prefer to remove 1.1 and make any changes to the policy once we have all the information in front of us and the review has been completed.
Councillor Fotakis.
I'm very reticent to amend the policy at this point in time on the basis of one vendor. So, I've just got concerns. I think we need to be more detailed in how we're approaching this situation. So,
Councillor Loden.
Similarly, a clarification, if we are deleting 1.1, then 1 becomes redundant, so it should just be deleting 1, I think, possibly.
Yes, that is correct. That would make sense. Councillor Murphy, are you happy as the mover of the amendment and seconder of the amendment? Thank you. I should have picked you up on that sooner. Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. So, talk about knee-jerk reactions or about... and I think Mayor Cole summed it up perfectly, where she was firmly of the view that there is... that the policy provides for the relocation of a vendor that is... of a situation, whilst this was highlighted by a complaint from the community in terms of the location of a vendor, but for me it actually just identified the area. We've heard from a number of elected members in the room who use the park frequently about the impact that it has on what is one of the great spaces in Hyde Park to kick a footy or to go and have a picnic, and what the officers will never see if they go there 600 times is how many people don't have picnics in that spot because they have a large painted truck sitting in the middle of it providing a cafe in that space. I think that there was an error made by this council, myself included, in actually providing a facility for food vendors to be in that space, given the rest of the nature of the policy. And to me, it's the tail wagging the dog saying we're having a knee-jerk reaction to one vendor. This has just highlighted a situation to me where there is an area within one of our great open spaces that is inappropriate to have this level of activity. I have no issue with this particular vendor up and moving 50 metres to the right in any of the locations that have been identified, or the existing zones within there. I don't think it unfairly prejudices this or any other vendor in their ability to be able to operate what is either a startup or an existing business or otherwise, but it says to the users of Hyde Park that a green open space that is grass, that is on a hill adjacent to a playground, is an appropriate place for families, individuals, people to hang out. I don't think this is anything targeting a vendor. It's removing an error in a policy that I feel that, not necessarily an error, but highlighting something that was an unintended consequence of a zone within a policy. And to me, that's the whole point of it. It's not a knee-jerk reaction to a single complaint. It's an issue that's been highlighted, and I think it's particularly the fact that Mayor Cole was firmly of the view that the policy provides provision for it to be dealt with. 3 or 4 members, and we'll see in a moment when we vote, clearly were of a view that it was of a situation such that we should make that change, and the officers are clearly of a view that the current situation is acceptable because they've visited many times and deemed it to be acceptable. So in the absence of that, I think we do need to make a decision as a council, and we're not prejudicing any vendor or activity in the park. We're just saying that green open space, by leaving it there, is more suitable for green open space.
Thank you, Mayor.
Before you go,
Sorry?
Councillor Harley just would like to respond that in discussion with the officers today, this has been provided by the Director of Engineering as alternate locations based on what's written in the policy. I believe that we haven't actually had an attempt at having some kind of consensus decision making with the vendor, and I think that we've applied the policy in an incredibly to the rule book fashion, and that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. This is not the town planning scheme that we're talking about. This is a mobile food vendor, and I think that if we spoke to the vendor and had some kind of discussion about the fact that in terms of the tables and chairs and the look and feel of the van, that could they remove some of the furniture, could they relocate, I believe that that is achievable based on the advice that the Director of Engineering has provided to me and to us on this page this evening.
Through you, Mayor. I don't support the amendment to delete this. It is part of the role of all good policymakers, and that's what we are. When you see something in a policy that has unintended consequences, it's okay to change it. You can call it policy on the run in a derogatory way, I guess, but policies change all the time in organisations. When you see it can change for a whole range of reasons, and they can change every month. That's okay. That's part of what we do as good policymakers. I've been down there many times. Look, it's a great location to go and have dinner. I won't argue with that. But it is unsightly, and I'm not sure we got it right. I'm really not sure we got it right. It is a really beautiful area of that park area, made much busier by the playground that's down there. And why would that vendor want to move? They have a pretty cheap business for 14 hours a day, 7 days a week in a prime park with a business down the road that's just closed down. So there's no other business around there that services that end of Hyde Park. They spread their tables and chairs out to such a radius that it wouldn't take much for another food vendor to come in there and that entire zone will be taken up. I respect that the administration have done their due diligence on 6 to 10 visits, but I just don't agree. I think it is unduly interfering with the amenity of that area. It is unsightly from a street level. It really is. It actually changes the view as you go down Glendower Street, because there's a caravan and there's those motors, those portable motor things. What are they called? There's a generator sitting there at the back. You can hear it. And if I was one of those people on that part of that park, I wouldn't be happy about having that Vistor 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. I just would be very unhappy, and I'm surprised we haven't had more complaints. But more importantly, that end of the park needs to be for for picnics and families. We're trying to activate a very activated park, and we have some very deactivated spaces in that park. And I think that's where the food vendors should be. If this is for the convenience of people to go and get a snack and something to eat, like the ice cream van and the coffee van, where people go up to the window, make their purchase, and they continue walking around the park, or they go and sit on the grass, I don't really understand why we wouldn't delete Area 1 and say, we probably didn't get that right. Certainly there's a number of people around this table who weren't party to that decision, so I'll take more share of the responsibility, because I did vote for this policy, and I think they should move. And clearly, while our policy provides for it, clearly it is not something our administration feel is an issue, but as a councillor, I do feel it's an issue, and so I don't support the removal the deletion. I support the removal of Area 1 and to require the vendor to move elsewhere in the park.
Councillor Loden.
Just a question. The map that was referred to with locations A and B, these would be locations that we could potentially amend the policy to move location 1, 2. These aren't currently, like, they wouldn't be able to move there now because that would not be compliant with the policy. Is that correct? Is that the way to understand that?
Yep. Through you, Mayor Cole. That's correct. That's my understanding. We have zones set aside in the policy, and these are currently not zones. But it will be down to council to amend the current policy to include these as zones, and then we could ask this vendor to move to one or either of those locations. And if you look at Area A, which is tucked between 2 trees, you would reduce the impact on the visual amenity from the road. You wouldn't see it. The generator would be further away from premises, and it would be essentially an extension of zone 1 that already exists. Sorry, zone 2. Yeah, that would be essentially an extension of the existing zone 2. So that is an option I think that's available to council.
And then just to further follow up on that, that would be something for consideration when this comes back in April, assuming the motion passes. That's not something we're doing at this point. We're not proposing to move the location at this point in time.
Through you, Michael. So from a parks perspective, I've personally visited the site 3 or 4 times. I think what my fellow director said is they are operating within the policy. You know, the noise is barely audible at the boundary of the site, etc. So he is complying with the policy. What we've sought to do by providing this plan is some other suitable locations that council could consider, and I think you could consider that now, or you could consider it as part of the wider review. So really it's just up to council how you'd want to proceed.
So it would remain open to you to remove an amendment, but we are dealing with the amendment on the table, which is to remove clauses. Where are we at now? So many that have been clause 1 and 1.1. So we'll have to deal with this amendment first. So is there any further debate on the removal of clause 1 and 1.1? Okay, I'll put it. All those in favour of removal of clause 1 and 1.1? All those against? That's lost. We're back to the substantive. Any further debate or amendments? Go ahead, Councillor Toppelberg.
Right. Look, I think the issue's potentially been blown a little bit out of proportion, but I do see an issue where we get clear advice from administration that their view is that because of the wording of the policy that the only basis on which they would make a change is noise, and we're then debating whether or not that can be interpreted differently. That's not for us to provide direction other than by council decision. So I think that the retention of, presumably once we vote on this, the retention of the removal of Area 1, I don't think it unfairly prejudices any operator, and I think that the event of potentially moving the current operator who has highlighted the issue to another area and still leaving the zone there would perhaps give rise to having the same issue again. Clearly, it's a 12-month licence, so clearly that the issue will be discussed and debated between now and then, and we'll have something, I think, that better clarifies what is clearly a divergent set of views and remembering that the policy deals with the matter across the whole of Vincent and across all of the areas that are identified within the policy. I will also note Mayor Cole's earlier comments about the review considering our approach to the use of cities, parks and reserves for commercial purposes. I'm not quite sure I understand what the issue is with the review considering our approach to it. My understanding is that that's what the review should do and actually have a statement on it, rather than, I don't think it, if we take, for example, the issue of the Hyde Park tea rooms, that was a notice of motion that was brought to this council in 2006 and lingered till about 2013. And we've had a couple of approaches in terms of a permanent kiosk utilising a disused section or an adjunct section to the existing toilet block in Hyde Park. That's been discussed in this particular location, but I think that we should have a broader view. There are uses that we have decided upon, including farmers markets or otherwise within our parks and reserves, that do provide for commercial activity, and there are divergent views in the community and presumably on council as to whether those are good, bad or otherwise and how frequent they should be. And I think that any policy that talks to mobile food vendor, we should more broadly, and perhaps it sits within our more appropriately in the POS strategy, but we should have some view of council on the level of commercial activity that we either allow or encourage. What highlights it for me is the fact that this area of I think if you go back to the recording when this was initially included, the policy initially had a limitation of I think 250 metres in a direct line to be able to have an area, and we actually changed the policy at the time to say 100 metres specifically to allow this area to exist given its proximity to the business Papillon, which was operating at the time. 3 years later, Papillon no longer exists. I'm not saying there's correlation between the two, but the idea of this particular location was actually, we specifically changed the policy to say that it was okay to have that level of activity in this location because we wanted to. We were looking specifically at it and reducing the I suppose proximity exclusion to other businesses offering similar services. So again, I said at the very beginning, this is not about targeting a particular business or not a knee-jerk reaction to a particular complaint. For me, an issue's been highlighted. It was brought to my attention in discussion with the officers. I felt there was an impasse between the wording of the policy and what I felt was a better outcome for the park. And I am certain that if we spend the whole of summer going and having a look at what's going on in what is currently depicted as location 1 within Hyde Park, if that is to be removed as a location for mobile food vendors, we will see exactly the sort of activity that we expect in our public open green spaces.
Councillor Toppelberg closed debate, so I'm going to have to put the motion. All those in favour? No, well, there's not much to vote on separately. Well, we've voted in relation to Clause 1, that's been lost, and then in relation to Clause 2, there's no amendment on the table to remove Clause 2.1.
My understanding was that you wanted to vote on it separately so that you could vote against it, that was all. That's okay, I'm happy not to.
Then I'll put it separately, okay. I'm putting Clause 1, which you've already voted on. All those in favour of Clause 1? All those against? I declare it carried. I'm putting Clause 2, initiate a review of the policy number 3.8.12 mobile food vendor policy and requires a report to be presented to Council by no longer than later than 30th of April 2019 to consider a revised policy for the purposes of public consultation. All those in favour of that clause ending at that full stop? Just that. And then separately dealing with the subclauses. Well, if you want, you need to vote on each and every part. So if you want that to then form a consistency, then you need to vote yes to all. Right.
So, point of order, Chair, do we have an amendment on the table to separate out 3 from 3.1, 3.2,
No, we do not have an amendment on the table. We're voting on the clauses separately. But it's pretty messy if you ask me. I think we should just put Clause 2 in its entirety. Yep. I'll put Clause 2, 2.1 and 2.2, 2.3. All those in favour? All those against? Declare it carried. Thank you. That concludes the reports that have been dealt with in public session. We do have one confidential item to consider behind closed doors, so could I please have a mover and seconder to go behind closed doors? Move Councillor Harley, seconded Councillor Hallett. All those in favour? Declare it carried. Mover and seconder to go to resume an open meeting. Move Councillor Gontaszewski, seconded Councillor Murphy. All those in favour? Declare it carried. Thank you. We're good to go. Thank you. We have just considered item 18.1, which was Leederville Gardens Incorporated Board appointments, and I'd like to read out the resolution of council. That council appoints 1.1, Mr Bradley Schrader for a further 3-year term, and 1.2, Ms Jane Wedgwood and Ms Pina Christie for a 3-year term as members of the Association and to the Board of Leederville Gardens Inc., commencing from 18th of November 2018 and ending on 17th of November 2021, and 2, advises the Board of Leederville Gardens Inc. of Council's decision. Thank you very much, and I declare the meeting closed at 8:05.